I remember that day all too clearly. The weather aroused no suspicion. No rain, no sun, just a dull grayness, as if the sky itself was ashamed to look down. I made the morning coffee as I had for so many years, with the same care life had taught me: a little vanilla, a spoonful of raw sugar, a bit of milk, just the way he liked it. But the cup sat untouched on the table, growing cold just as I did inside at that moment. He came in holding a piece of paper, without the usual weariness on his face, without any trace of former affection. I didn't need to read it to understand. The decision had already been made. Every step he took, every movement told me so. Where there once was respect, now there was calculation. I heard an invisible door slam shut between us. He said I would now have to pay rent, in my own house, the house where I raised him, where I wiped blood from scraped knees, where I cooked soup when he was sick. He no longer saw me as a mother. I had become a burden to him, an unprofitable expense, a useless element in his well-organized adult life. I didn't cry. No, even tears would have felt like humiliation. Instead, I simply stood up, went upstairs, took out the old suitcase, the very one I arrived in this city with 40 years ago, and began to pack, slowly, calmly. Each shirt, each sweater, each folded towel was a small goodbye to the home, the past, the illusions. I felt something inside me die, slowly, almost painlessly, like a candle fading out. I left without a word. He didn't stop me. He may not have even looked at my back. I closed the door behind me and walked away without turning around. The street felt longer than usual, and the wind brushed against my cheeks, but there was no sorrow, no fear, only emptiness. Emptiness louder than any scream. I rented a small room in a part of town that smelled of dust and age. No one knew me there. Not as a mother, not as a woman, not as someone who once built her life from scratch, selling everything to open a small café in the city center. I allowed myself to disappear, to dissolve into the silence. But he didn't know I still owned the café. The documents were in my name. The shares, transferred through third parties, had been given to me by his father years before he died. I had never mentioned it. I just wanted my son to feel as though he had achieved everything on his own. Let him think it was his business, his triumph. Let him believe. I let that myth live because I was a mother and because it felt right. I watched as the cafe grew, as he hired new staff, brought in new chairs, changed the sign. He made it trendy, but I had poured my soul into it. Every recipe, every corner, even the light that hit the window at 5 in the evening. I had built it all before he had even finished school. He never knew how deeply I was woven into that business. Didn't know that every morning, when he closed the door behind him, the documents came back to me. Every change was approved by me. Every contract passed through my hands. Now that I'm no longer needed as a mother, I decided I no longer need to be his silent support. He cast me aside as something redundant, unnecessary. I accepted that. And now it was time for me to make my move. Without anger, without revenge, just with the same coldness with which that paper had been handed to me. I filed the paperwork to sell the cafe. A buyer came quickly, a chain, looking for a ready-made brand with a solid reputation. They were generous, almost $500,000 for the business my son thought was his. He knew nothing. He wasn't even told directly. The deal went through the lawyers, and that was only the beginning. After the sale, everything unfolded almost silently. No calls, no letters, no knock at the door. The day the money hit the account was no different from any other. I sat in my small room, where the curtains didn't quite cover the old stains on the wallpaper, and listened to someone taking out the trash outside. The money brought no relief. It simply existed. Numbers on a screen. The price for which I had exchanged a piece of my soul. I felt no triumph, not even a sense of justice. Everything happened so clinically, as if I had signed a document authorizing the felling of an old tree. A tree I had planted, nurtured, watered. But the tree no longer gave shade. Its roots had pushed me out of the very soil I had stood on. So perhaps it was necessary. My son didn't know. I overheard his employees saying the deal had been unexpected, that head office made the call. He was simply informed that, starting next month, he would no longer be the manager. Surprise, humiliation, fury, all of that may have crossed his face, but I didn't see it. I didn't want to. I remembered his childhood eyes, his little hands reaching for me, those evenings when he was afraid of the dark, and I sat by his bed until he fell asleep. I taught him kindness, respect, gratitude. I read him books where heroes overcame evil, saved the weak, protected their loved ones. And then, I myself became one of the forgotten. He never even called. Not once. Not when the cafe was sold. Not when he received the notice removing him from management. He didn't know who to call. Didn't know it should have been me. Or maybe he suspected, but pride held him back. I walked past the cafe, now no longer mine, as if past a grave. The sign had changed, the interior refreshed. The place that used to smell of cinnamon and coffee was now bright, noisy, empty inside. I never went in. I didn't want to see how something I had poured my heart into had become just another item in a corporate portfolio. Each morning started the same. Wake up, make coffee, stare out the window in silence. I made no new plans, searched for no new purpose. It felt as if his rejection had erased my very need to exist. There was no resentment, only a weary, gray emptiness. Neither memories nor even money could fill it. Emptiness has no shape, it just is, always near. People told me, take a vacation, buy something, start over. But they didn't understand. I had already started over, many times. I started over when I became a widow at 30, when I opened the cafe with $2,000 in an envelope, when I got back on my feet after illness. But now I didn't need to start over. Everything I wanted, I had already created, and it had rejected me. Sometimes I remembered when he first offered to name the cafe after me. I declined. I thought he should feel it was his achievement. I believed that was the right thing to do. I let him wear my love like armor, without telling him it was built on my labor. I loved silently, and that was my mistake, because he learned not to notice. One night, lying in the silence, I realized, perhaps he no longer remembered how it all began. Maybe he believed the cafe was entirely his journey, the result of his effort alone. He didn't know how I lay awake, night after night, wondering how to pay the rent that first year, how I skipped meals to pay the cook's wages, how I met suppliers in freezing weather without a coat because I couldn't afford heating. And now everything we had became two separate worlds, mine, filled with silence and memories, and his, broken, lost, without understanding how he had lost it. But I was still alive, still capable of making choices. I wasn't planning revenge, but I knew this wasn't the end. Let him never find out exactly how the cafe slipped from his hands. But he must know this. The roots he cut ran deeper than he ever imagined. I began to remember more and more, not because I wanted to, but because memories were all I had left. They didn't come in fragments, but in full scenes. The smell of fresh pastries at 6 in the morning, how my son and I painted the walls of that old place, how he, just a boy then, carried bags of flour, smiling proudly that he was helping. Back then, he looked up at me as if I were a fortress. Back then, he knew who I was to him. Now he had forgotten, or wanted to forget. I spent a week sitting in the library, sorting through old papers, draft menus, photographs from the cafe's early days. I hadn't kept them for myself. I thought one day I would give them to him. Maybe on his wedding day. Maybe when he had a child of his own. So he could see how it all began. So he could be proud. Now I gathered them to remind myself I existed. I wasn't just a shadow in his biography. I was the architect of his beginning. And I wanted someone, anyone, to know that, even if it wasn't him. Each morning I got up a little earlier. I started baking again. At first, just for myself. Then for the neighbors. Pies, rolls, small biscuits, filled with the same care that once filled the cafe. People started to come, humble, simple, with grateful eyes. They didn't care who I used to be. What mattered to them was how the kitchen smelled and what they carried home in a paper bag. One day, someone said to me, "You have the hands of someone who makes not food, but warmth." It was strange, almost painful, because that warmth, that exact warmth, my son had stopped feeling. Or maybe he simply chose not to. But strangers saw it, felt it. So I knew I could still give. I hadn't disappeared. Sometimes I saw him, by chance, walking by, thin, sharp-edged, with tired eyes. He no longer smiled. He looked lost. I never approached him, never said hello. I had no desire to humiliate him. I didn't want to prove anything. I just watched, as someone once so sure of his own strength began to realize the ground beneath his feet was never really his, that the roots he had cut were the very ones holding him up. He tried to open another cafe, I heard, but he didn't have the foundation, the silence in the heart from which real work is born. Everything he did now felt like a soulless imitation, and that broke my heart more than anything that came before. I didn't rejoice in his fall. I mourned with him, because despite the pain, I still remembered the boy who ran to me, cheeks flushed, holding his first earned money. $40 for helping a customer choose coffee. He was so proud then, so pure. I didn't know if he would ever come back to me. I wasn't waiting, but inside, I understood. A legacy isn't property. It isn't a cafe. It's what you pour into another person. And I had poured everything into him, even if he threw it away. All that time, I tried not to think about him. I kept reminding myself that every person has the right to choose, even if that choice is to walk away from you. But motherhood isn't a contract, not a role you can resign from. It's part of your body, part of your breath. I couldn't erase him from my heart, but I learned not to touch that pain, not to go near it. Rumors, as always, found me faster than I wanted. Through a neighbor, a cashier at the grocery store, a former waitress from the cafe. They said he was broken, that he'd been evicted, that the new owner had changed everything beyond recognition, and his name no longer appeared on any documents. He had lost not just the business, but his identity. In this town, he was no longer that young entrepreneur. He had become ordinary. One day, I stepped out to the store and saw him. He stood at a bus stop, a backpack on his shoulders, staring down at the pavement, his shoulders slumped, arms hanging limp. There was no trace of that arrogant glint anymore, only the weariness of someone who had fallen for a long time and finally hit the ground. I hid behind an ad stand, like a coward, but I couldn't go to him. He didn't know I was there. And maybe that was for the best. We were both on the edge, each in our own way. That night, I didn't sleep. I tried to imagine what it must feel like, to lose everything, thinking it would always be yours. But even more terrifying, to realize you hadn't lost something, but someone, not the business, not the money, but the person who had loved you without condition, and you had thrown them away. I kept thinking of the words where it all began. Pay rent or leave. No pity, no explanation, no hesitation in his voice. He said it coldly, firmly, as if I weren't his mother, but a tenant who had overstayed. But now I saw he was paying for those words, not with money, but with pain, with loneliness, with the collapse of his illusions. I looked at that cup like a piece of wreckage after a storm. Maybe he would make it back, or maybe he would just drift further away. But now I knew. I wasn't alone. My shadow had fallen again in someone's memory, and that meant I had been. After the cup, the silence changed. It was no longer as heavy as before. It no longer cut through the air. It simply was. There was no bitterness left in it, only a tired acceptance. Something had changed, not loudly, not with drama, but quietly inside. I was still living alone, still waking up early, baking for the neighbors, putting bread into paper bags with their names, leaving them at their doors. But now, every morning began with the question, what will he say if he comes back? I didn't know where he lived now. Sometimes it seemed like he was hiding on purpose, not because he was afraid, but because he wasn't ready to look me in the eyes. I didn't search for him. I decided that if fate had narrowed our path, he would come on his own, and if not, it wasn't time yet. He didn't return the letter, he didn't call, but the cup left on my windowsill was a beginning. It was his way of speaking without words. Maybe it meant more than any letter. He returned a part of himself, the part he left before the quarrel. And no matter how hard I tried to stay cold, I felt something warm stir inside my chest again. One Friday, I decided to visit the old neighborhood where I once opened the café. Not on the same street, no, just nearby. I wanted to feel if that air still breathed. I walked past the small shops, everything familiar but different now. The people had changed. The signs were brighter but colder. No one recognized me, and that was almost a relief. When I passed the cafe itself, now someone else's renamed, with new windows and a glossy interior, I suddenly stopped, not out of nostalgia, but because he was inside, alone, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee in his hands. He was staring into the void in front of him, not at the display, not at the people, but inside himself. I didn't hide, I just stood there and looked at him like before, when he was little and got lost in the playground, forgetting where he ran off to. His face was empty. He didn't look angry or confused, just broken, like someone who realized for the first time that he had lost not an object but a person, and that the way back no longer depended only on desire. That night I made a decision, not out of revenge, not out of pride, out of a sense of closure. The cafe was no longer the place we had built. It was a shell, now filled with someone else's meaning. It held neither my warmth nor his memory anymore. But as long as it existed, he couldn't let go. Selling the cafe was not a spontaneous idea. The documents had long been in a folder, just waiting for the moment. I knew I could do it, not out of hurt, but because it was already over. The cafe was no longer ours, and now it had to go for good. The buyer was found quickly. A coffee chain from another city. They needed a location, not a story. They didn't care who had owned it, who laid the tiles, who brewed the first coffee on the old stove. They needed the building, the location, the infrastructure. They offered a sum I didn't even expect, $480,000. I signed the papers the next morning, without emotion, without tears, as if I had just finished a long walk and closed the gate behind me. My son found out the same day. One of the former employees wrote to him. In the evening, someone knocked on the door, quietly, once. I knew who it was, and my heart beat like it did in my youth, but I didn't open right away. I walked to the door, stopped, and just stood there. He was there on the other side. For the first time, not the owner, not a judge, just a son. Lost, broken, returning to where he left. He stood at the door for a long time. I could feel his silence. It was heavier than a scream. I didn't hear words or footsteps, only breathing, even, as if restrained. I even thought he was holding onto the doorframe as if without it he would fall. I didn't know what he was waiting for. An answer? An explanation? Forgiveness? Or just any kind of contact, even if I opened the door and said nothing. But I didn't open it. I stood on the other side of the wood, and between us were not just centimeters, but years, losses, pride, and the silence we ourselves had nurtured. I remembered the day he first said, "Pay the rent or leave." Back then, there was no conversation between us either. Only his terms, his rules, his gaze, cold as if I were nobody. He turned away without waiting for an answer, simply left the kitchen, then my life. That's when I understood there would be no more talks. We speak through actions. And now I was doing the same. He chose money, not as a resource, but as a value. He put a price on the home, on motherhood, on memory. I simply sent the bill, not to take revenge, but to finish. I didn't need explanations, repentant looks, his sorry, especially if it was spoken not out of understanding, but fear. Something rustled behind the door. He probably knelt down. Not begging, just tired of standing. Maybe he didn't know what to say. Maybe he wanted me to come out first. I pressed my forehead against the frame without opening. Not because I was afraid, but because there were no words worthy. I slowly opened the door when the footsteps faded into the distance. An empty hallway, no traces. Only a folded piece of paper left at the threshold. I picked it up. There were no words, just an old photograph, the two of us by the first menu board. I'm laughing, he's smiling. He had just graduated from college then. I handed him the first set of keys. Back then, it was a beginning. Now, a reminder. I didn't cry, but I sat down on the floor right by the door and stared at the photo for a long time. Not as a memory, but as proof that it had been. That he once knew how to be close. That night I didn't sleep. I just sat by the window with a cup of tea while the streetlights outside went out. He didn't come back, didn't write, and I didn't try to find him either. Some conversations don't need words. Sometimes the most important things in life are exactly what remains unspoken. And I knew, if he ever knocks again, it won't be a plea or a regret. It will be a choice, his choice, conscious, free. And for now, let him go. Let him feel what he lost. Not property, not a café, but the part of himself that once knew where home was. A week passed, then another. Life went on as before. Mornings with silence, days with bread, evenings with quiet. No calls, no letters. He didn't come back. And I stopped waiting. To wait means to hope, and I no longer lived in hope. I lived in fact. Everything that was happened. Everything that could have been, wasn't, didn't happen. Sometimes I looked at the photo he left, not out of weakness, but to remind myself, he once knew how to love. Once. Which means I wasn't wrong. He changed, not me. He chose a path that rejected everything between us. The cafe's new owner started renovations. I walked by, without pain, without interest, only with the indifference that comes when there's no connection inside anymore. Everything that was ours was torn out by the roots. The sign, the old tiles, even the counter by the window, where we once sat together with coffee in hand. A new life, a stranger's. I no longer needed to go there. But one day, a woman stopped me. Young, energetic, from the new owner's team. She recognized me from old photos in the archive, where the two of us, my son and I, smiled by the first coffee machine. And she asked, "Is that you? You opened this place, right?" I nodded. She was silent, then added, "It's a pity you're no longer seen here. Everything here seems to have lost its soul. They say it used to be different, warmer." I didn't answer, just smiled. But something shifted inside me. Not pain, more like, sorry I didn't see it. Everything fell apart because I took away the main thing. I lost everything. But the worst is not the cafe. It's you. Forgive me if you can. If you can't, I'll accept it. I didn't cry. I didn't know what to say, and maybe I didn't have to. He understood. Truly, not when everything went wrong, but only now, when all that he considered his own was left with only a photo and silence. To forgive means to acknowledge the pain. I still didn't know if I was ready for that, because forgiveness is not a word. It's a bridge. He spoke in a whisper, barely lifting his head. His voice trembled, not from cold, but from realization, from defeat, from losing himself. He, who once kicked me out of the house, now stood at the doorstep and asked. I silently opened the door and stepped inside. Not a gesture of invitation, just left it open. He came in without a word, as if he knew there was nothing left to ask. Inside, he was a stranger.